The news hit the quiet town of Havenwood like a sudden, unexpected frost. Eleanor Vance, the matriarch, the pillar of the community, had passed away peacefully in her sleep at 92. Her life had been a tapestry woven with kindness, resilience, and an unwavering commitment to her family. A family she had built from scratch after arriving in this country with nothing but hope in her heart. She wasn't wealthy by modern standards, but her home, a sprawling Victorian filled with generations of memories, and the small fortune she had carefully accumulated over decades, represented a legacy far richer than mere money. Everyone knew Eleanor had a deep sense of fairness, almost a spiritual compass that guided her every decision. Her funeral was a testament to her impact, drawing people from all walks of life. Among them were her two children, Martha, her eldest, a schoolteacher known for her quiet strength and empathy, who had devoted countless hours to caring for Eleanor in her final years, and Robert, her younger son, a businessman whose ambition often overshadowed his compassion, a man who, despite his mother's endless support, always seemed to want more. The tension between the siblings, often unspoken, was almost palpable in the hushed, grief-laden air of the church. It was a tension rooted in differing values, in differing interpretations of what Eleanor truly represented. Martha sought to honor her mother's memory through service. Robert sought to honor it through acquisition. As the eulogies concluded and the mourners dispersed, a new, unsettling chapter began to unfold. Whispers had already started circulating about Eleanor's final wishes, specifically concerning her will. Some talked of Robert's persistent presence in his mother's last months, subtly guiding her decisions, while others pointed to Martha's steadfast, unassuming care. The truth, however, often remains hidden until the moment it is forced into the light, much like the sun breaking through a dense fog. The family lawyer, Mr. Davies, a man as old and as rooted in Havenwood as Eleanor herself, had the unenviable task of revealing those truths. The air thickened with anticipation, not just of grief, but of something far more complex: expectation, entitlement, and perhaps a brewing storm of injustice that threatened to unravel the very fabric Eleanor had so carefully woven. The stage was set for a revelation that would test not only familial bonds, but also the very belief in what is right. If this story resonates with your own experiences of fighting for what's fair, or if you believe in a justice that transcends human courts, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more narratives of resilience and faith, inspiring hope in a world that often feels unbalanced. We believe every voice matters in reminding us that even in the darkest moments, light can prevail. The day of the will reading arrived, cloaked in a tense silence that made the ticking of the antique grandfather clock in Mr. Davies's office seem deafening. Martha sat stiffly beside her husband, David, a quiet man who offered what comfort he could through a reassuring squeeze of her hand. Across the room, Robert leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips, his wife, Brenda, radiating an almost smug confidence. Other distant relatives, mostly observers curious about the Vance estate, occupied the remaining seats, their faces a mixture of solemnity and barely concealed speculation. Mr. Davies, with his spectacles perched on his nose, cleared his throat, his gaze sweeping over the assembled family. He began to read, his voice steady, reciting the standard legal boilerplate, but everyone was waiting for the core of Eleanor's final wishes. He detailed various small bequests to charities and a few distant cousins, then moved to the primary assets, the family home, and Eleanor's considerable financial portfolio. As he spoke, Martha felt a chill creep up her spine, not from the words themselves, but from the shift in Robert's demeanor, a subtle straightening of his posture, a predatory glint in his eye. Then came the bombshell. The bulk of Eleanor's estate, including the beloved Victorian home where Martha had grown up and where she had cared for her mother, was bequeathed solely to Robert. Martha was to receive a modest annuity, barely a fraction of the total value, and no claim to the house. The room seemed to tilt. Martha's breath caught in her throat. She looked at Robert, expecting to see some flicker of remorse or awkwardness, but found only triumph. Brenda even allowed herself a small, audible gasp of satisfaction. Martha's mind reeled. This wasn't Eleanor. This wasn't the mother she knew, the woman who had always championed fairness and equality. Her indignation began to simmer, a slow, burning heat beneath the shock and grief. The injustice felt like a physical blow, not just to her inheritance, but to her very understanding of her mother's character. She tried to reconcile the loving, equitable Eleanor with the Eleanor whose will now sat like a cold, unfeeling stone, favoring one child so disproportionately over the other. The lawyer's voice continued, a distant drone, as Martha's world began to crumble around her, the weight of an unimaginable betrayal pressing down. The aftermath of the will reading was a blur of polite condolences and thinly veiled awkwardness from the distant relatives, all swiftly dismissed by Robert, who, after a perfunctory handshake with Martha, quickly exited the office. Martha remained numb, the legal documents rustling in her hand. Mr. Davies, sensing her distress, offered a hesitant, "I'm so sorry, Martha. Your mother made these decisions quite clearly in recent months." His words, intended as comfort, only deepened the sting. Recent months. That was when Robert had been a constant fixture at Eleanor's side, while Martha, juggling her teaching job and her own family, visited every day, but wasn't sleeping over, as Robert frequently did. Walking out into the bright afternoon sun, Martha felt a profound sense of disorientation. The town, usually a source of comfort, now seemed to mock her with its normalcy. How could her mother, a woman who meticulously planned everything with equal measure, have made such a drastic and seemingly unfair decision? The small annuity felt like a consolation prize, an afterthought, while Robert, who had often been financially reckless, now held the reins of Eleanor's entire legacy. David, ever supportive, tried to reassure her, suggesting there might be a misunderstanding, but the cold facts on the page were stark. Over the next few days, the initial shock gave way to a gnawing indignation. Martha replayed conversations with her mother, searching for clues, for any sign that Eleanor had changed her mind about the equitable division she had always promised. But there was nothing. Only memories of a mother who valued both her children equally, who taught them to share and to be fair. Robert, on the other hand, began almost immediately to assert his new ownership, making calls about renovations to the house, discussing selling off certain antiques, the very items Martha cherished as tangible links to her mother's life. His casual disregard for sentiment, even as they were still mourning, felt like a deliberate provocation. Martha knew she couldn't let this stand, not just for herself, but for the memory of the Eleanor she truly knew. Martha tried to talk to Robert. She called him repeatedly, leaving messages that were increasingly urgent, but her calls went unanswered. When she finally caught him at Eleanor's house, supervising movers packing up some of her mother's furniture, the encounter was brief and chilling. "Martha, what are you doing here?" he asked, his tone impatient, as if she were an intruder in her childhood home. She tried to appeal to his sense of family, to the memories, to the obvious unfairness of the situation. "Robert, Mother always said the house would be ours, shared. She would never have done this." He scoffed, a dismissive wave of his hand. Mother clearly changed her mind. "It's all legal, Martha." Mr. Davies confirmed it. "It's my house now. And frankly, your annuity is quite generous considering you have your own family and a stable income." He paused, looking around the living room with a proprietary air. "I need to make some changes around here, modernize. This place is a museum." His words were a dagger, twisting the knife in the wound. He wasn't just taking the inheritance, he was erasing Eleanor's presence, disrespecting her legacy. The finality in his voice, the cold indifference in his eyes, confirmed Martha's worst fears. Robert wasn't going to budge. He saw no injustice, only his rightful gain. Martha left the house that day not just heartbroken, but truly angered. It wasn't about the money or the house itself, as much as it was about the principles her mother stood for, and the callous way Robert was trampling over them. This wasn't mere sibling squabbling. This was a deliberate act of exclusion, a distortion of Eleanor's final wishes that felt deeply wrong. She knew then that she couldn't simply accept this. She had to fight, not out of greed, but out of a fierce loyalty to her mother's true spirit and a desperate need to see justice served. The quiet school teacher was beginning to find a fire within her. Martha sought legal counsel, choosing a young, sharp attorney named Sarah Jenkins, who had a reputation for taking on challenging cases. Sarah listened intently, her brow furrowed as Martha recounted the events, presenting the will and describing Robert's unyielding stance. "This is unusual, Martha," Sarah admitted. "While a parent can leave their estate to whomever they wish, a complete reversal of long-held intentions, especially given your dedicated care for your mother, raises questions. We're looking for undue influence." The term hung in the air, heavy with implication. It suggested Robert hadn't just benefited from the will, but actively manipulated its creation. The path ahead, Sarah warned, would be difficult and emotionally taxing. Challenging a will, especially one legally executed, required substantial evidence of coercion or lack of testamentary capacity. "We need proof, Martha. Witnesses who can attest to Eleanor's state of mind in those final months, or evidence that Robert exerted control." Martha felt a surge of hope, quickly followed by a wave of exhaustion. How could she prove something so insidious? Eleanor had always been sharp, even in her 90s, but her physical frailty had increased, making her more susceptible to influence. The initial inquiries proved frustrating. Family friends were reluctant to speak against Robert, fearing estrangement. Some recalled Eleanor mentioning her discussions with Robert about financial matters, but nothing concrete about the will change. The home health aide who had been with Eleanor in her last months had since moved out of state. It felt like every door Martha tried to open was met with a polite but firm wall. Robert, it seemed, had been meticulous in his manipulation, leaving few obvious traces. Yet, Martha refused to be deterred. She held on to the conviction that Eleanor, the true Eleanor, would never have knowingly enacted such an unfair distribution. Her quiet resolve hardened, fueled by a growing sense that this was not just about an inheritance, but about truth itself. The struggle was intensifying, revealing just how deeply entrenched the injustice truly was. As the weeks turned into months, Martha's fight became an open secret in Havenwood. Some sympathized with her, whispering about Robert's history of avarice. Others, particularly those connected to Robert's business dealings, dismissed her efforts as sour grapes, an attempt by a jealous sibling to overturn their mother's final wishes. Robert himself began to subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, discredit Martha. He'd make comments at community events about Martha's unhealthy attachment to the past or her difficulty accepting reality. These remarks, while seemingly innocuous, chipped away at Martha's reputation, creating a narrative that painted her as unreasonable and resentful. The social isolation began to wear on her. Even some family members who had initially offered quiet support now distanced themselves, unwilling to be caught in the crossfire between the siblings. Martha felt increasingly alone, facing not only the legal battle, but a quiet campaign of character assassination. She confided in David, her husband, who remained her steadfast anchor. "It feels like everyone thinks I'm wrong, David, that I'm just being greedy." David, however, saw deeper. "They don't know your mother like you did, Martha. They don't know your heart. This isn't about greed for you. It's about honor, about proving what you know to be true." His words bolstered her, reminding her of the deeper reason for her struggle. It wasn't just about the house or the money. It was about protecting Eleanor's true memory, about ensuring her legacy wasn't tainted by Robert's selfish actions. She understood now the complex layers of human motivation, how greed could twist perceptions, and how fear could silence well-meaning people. This wasn't just a legal case. It was a test of character, of resilience, and of faith. Martha knew that to give up would be to surrender not just her claim, but her integrity, and more importantly, her mother's. The path ahead was dark, yet a faint inner light refused to be extinguished. The search for concrete evidence of undue influence continued to be an uphill battle. Sarah Jenkins exhausted every lead, tracking down former caregivers, interviewing neighbors, and examining Eleanor's financial records for any unusual transactions or large gifts made to Robert around the time the will was updated. Each avenue led to a dead end, or to information too ambiguous to be useful in court. Eleanor had indeed been frail, but mentally competent, at least on the surface, making it difficult to argue she lacked the capacity to make her own decisions. Robert, it seemed, had expertly navigated the thin line between persuasion and coercion. During one particularly discouraging meeting, Sarah spread out the files on her desk. "Martha, we have a strong moral argument, but legally it's thin. We have no smoking gun. No witness willing to state on record that Robert pressured your mother directly. No sudden, unexplained financial transfers. His actions appear to have been subtle, almost imperceptible to an outsider. Martha felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. Was this it? Was she destined to lose, despite her unwavering conviction? The thought of Robert selling her childhood home, erasing all traces of her mother, filled her with despair. Yet a stubborn refusal to yield still flickered within her. She knew Eleanor. She knew the depth of her mother's character, her absolute commitment to fairness. It was an instinct, a deep-seated knowing that something fundamentally unjust had occurred. This wasn't just about legal technicalities. It was about a profound, moral wrong. Martha found herself retreating into memories of her mother, seeking solace and strength. She recalled Eleanor's quiet sayings, her words of wisdom. "Justice isn't always swift, Martha," her mother once told her, "but it has a way of finding its path, even through the densest thickets." This memory became a fragile thread of hope, an almost spiritual whisper that kept her from succumbing entirely to the despair. Perhaps, she thought, she was looking in the wrong places for the truth. The legal fees began to mount, adding another layer of stress to Martha's already strained life. She and David dipped into their savings, a nest egg carefully accumulated for their retirement. Doubts crept in, insidious voices questioning if she was being selfish, if she was fighting a losing battle, if she was doing more harm than good to her own family's security. David, though supportive, grew quieter, his worry etched on his face. Their son, a college student, even suggested, albeit gently, that perhaps it was time to let it go. "It's just money, Mom," he had said, "and you're tearing yourself apart." But for Martha, it wasn't just money. It was integrity. It was the principle. It was the memory of Eleanor. To concede now would be to validate Robert's actions, to allow a clear injustice to prevail. She felt a deep internal conflict, the practical concerns of her family's future clashing with her unwavering conviction in her mother's true intentions. She started spending hours in the local church, seeking quiet contemplation, finding solace in the stained glass light and the hushed echoes of prayer. She wasn't a devout churchgoer in the traditional sense, but in her moment of deepest turmoil, she found herself seeking a strength beyond her own. One Sunday, the visiting preacher, a man with kind eyes and a resonant voice, spoke of ancient wisdom. "God sets the scales at sundown," he said, meaning that even when human justice fails, a higher order is at work. Truth has a way of coming to light in its own time, often in the most unexpected ways, when we least expect it, and when all human avenues seem exhausted. His words struck Martha with the force of a revelation. It wasn't about her own strength or Sarah's legal prowess alone. It was about something bigger, a faith that transcended the courtroom. That week, she resolved to continue, not with renewed aggression, but with a quiet, persistent belief that the truth, like the rising sun, would eventually emerge. The conviction, though unseen, held her steady. Martha decided to approach the situation from a different angle. Instead of solely focusing on Robert's manipulation, she began to reconstruct Eleanor's last months in minute detail, looking for anything out of character, any anomaly that might have been overlooked. She revisited old photo albums, scrolled through her mother's digital calendar, and even walked through the now sparsely furnished Victorian home, trying to feel Eleanor's presence, to remember every detail of their last conversations. It was an exercise in painful nostalgia, but she hoped it might jog a hidden memory. She remembered a specific conversation a few months before Eleanor's passing. Her mother had seemed a little anxious, more so than usual. Eleanor had mentioned that Robert was helping her organize some old papers, including her financial documents and estate plans. Martha had dismissed it at the time as Robert being helpful, but now it sounded different. "He's very efficient, Martha," Eleanor had said, with a slight, almost imperceptible tremor in her voice. "He knows how to get things done." At the time, Martha had taken it as a compliment. Now, the lawyer's call came on a Tuesday, cutting through Sarah's mundane afternoon of balancing ledgers and managing the modest finances of the community center. It wasn't the usual dry update on the center's legal matters, but a tone of cautious intrigue. "Miss Thompson," he began, "a peculiar detail has surfaced regarding your late uncle's estate. It appears a clause, previously deemed unenforceable, might have been misinterpreted. A new precedent, set just last month, effectively reopens the possibility of its validity. Sarah felt a jolt, a cold wave washing over her before a flicker of defiance sparked. For years, she had buried the bitterness of the inheritance, the one her uncle had promised her for decades of loyal care, only to see it vanish into the hands of her cousins, Mark and Lisa. They had always been adept at twisting truths, their charm a thin veil over their avarice. She remembered their smug smiles at the will reading, their feigned condolences barely concealing their glee as the family lawyer, a man they'd brought in, had declared the key part of her uncle's wishes invalid due to a technicality. The wound had never fully healed, merely scarred over, now threatening to tear open again. Yet this wasn't just pain. It was a burgeoning sense of hope, a fragile seed daring to sprout in barren ground. The preacher's words echoed from Sunday. God sets the scales at sundown. Could this be the dawn? Her heart pounded, a drumbeat of uncertainty mixed with an almost forbidden excitement. She knew challenging Mark and Lisa would unleash their full venom, but the thought of justice, however distant, felt like a breath of fresh air. This unexpected call wasn't just about money. It was about dignity, about the quiet hum of right finally attempting to assert itself. The path ahead was unclear, shrouded in the old manipulations and new legal complexities, but a tiny flame of purpose had been ignited within her, urging her forward into the fray she had long tried to avoid. Sarah spent the next few days in a whirlwind of suppressed anxiety and meticulous preparation. Her lawyer, Mr. Davies, explained the new legal interpretation in intricate detail, highlighting how a recent, unrelated court decision had inadvertently shone a light on the obscure clause in her uncle's will. It stated that if certain charitable donations specified by the uncle were not met within 5 years of his passing, the primary beneficiary, Mark, would forfeit a significant portion of the inheritance, which would then revert to Sarah, his designated alternative. Mark and Lisa, with their slick lawyer, had ensured the clause was dismissed as aspirational but non-binding. Now it held teeth. Sarah remembered her uncle's fierce commitment to charity, especially for the local orphanage he'd supported all his life. She had no doubt he'd intended for that clause to be binding. However, she also knew how easily Mark could fabricate evidence. He had a history of elaborate schemes, always meticulously planned to benefit himself. She recalled a time when he'd forged her signature on a club membership form just to gain access to a tennis court. It was a minor incident, but it revealed a deeper flaw in his character, a willingness to cross ethical lines for personal gain. This time, the stakes were astronomical. The inheritance was not merely a sum of money. It was a legacy, a testament to her uncle's values Mark had so casually disregarded. Sarah began to gather what little evidence she had. Old letters from her uncle discussing his charitable plans, faded receipts from his regular donations, and even a diary entry where he specifically mentioned the safeguard in his will. Every piece felt like a tiny stone being added to a slingshot, preparing for a battle against giants. She understood that mere paperwork might not be enough to combat Mark's cunning, but she had to try, compelled by a sense of duty, not just to herself, but to her uncle's memory and his true intentions. The first formal letter from Mr. Davies, notifying Mark and Lisa of the inheritance reevaluation, was met with predictable fury. Mark's voicemail, accessed by Sarah, was a tirade of accusations, threats, and a thinly veiled attempt to intimidate her into dropping the case. "You're grasping at straws, Sarah," his voice boomed, distorted by the phone speaker. "Uncle Robert would be rolling in his grave if he knew you were tearing the family apart over this. It's over. It's always been over." Lisa's email was more insidious, dripping with false concern and veiled warnings about the costs and emotional toll of a prolonged legal battle. "Think of the family, Sarah," it read. "The stress this will put on poor Aunt Martha, who's already so frail. Do you really want to drag her into this mess?" Sarah knew their tactics well. They were masters of manipulation, always ready to weaponize sentimentality or perceived familial duty. She remembered how Lisa had once convinced their grandmother to change her will, claiming Sarah was too irresponsible with money, a blatant lie to secure more for herself. The anger that flared within her wasn't just for herself, but for her uncle, whose legacy they had twisted, and for the countless other small injustices they had perpetrated over the years. But beneath the indignation, a resolve hardened. This wasn't about vengeance, it was about truth. The legal system, she knew, was a labyrinth, but she held on to the conviction that justice, however slow, would find its way. The community center's board, upon hearing about her personal battle, offered their quiet support, reminding her of the larger principles she upheld in her daily work. This network of quiet encouragement, a stark contrast to her cousin's venom, fortified her spirit, giving her the courage to stand firm against their storm of negativity. Mr. Davies moved quickly, filing the necessary motions to officially reopen the estate. The legal proceedings began to unfold, revealing the slow, deliberate pace of justice. Mark and Lisa, through their equally aggressive lawyer, filed counter-motions, attempting to dismiss Sarah's claim as frivolous. Their arguments centered on the established precedent and the finality of the original settlement, portraying Sarah as a disgruntled relative stirring up trouble. They painted a picture of a harmonious family torn apart by one greedy individual. Sarah, however, remained resolute. She provided her lawyer with every scrap of information she had, detailing her uncle's life, his values, and the meticulous care she had provided him in his final years. She recounted stories of this unexpected turn. This reopening of the ancient will sent ripples through the small town. Eleanor, our protagonist, felt a mix of trepidation and a flicker of hope she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge in years. The original lawyer, a man named Arthur Sterling, had been a fixture in the community for decades, his word practically law. To challenge his handling of the inheritance now felt like blasphemy to some, particularly those who had benefited from the original, skewed distribution. The initial legal hurdles were immense, designed to discourage any challenger. Petitions were filed, counter-petitions swiftly followed, each demanding countless hours of research and legal fees that stretched Eleanor's meager savings to their breaking point. Yet, a peculiar, quiet strength had settled within her. The old preacher's words, "God sets the scales at sundown," had taken root, not as a fanciful saying, but as a tangible promise. She began to see the small victories, not as coincidences, but as confirmations of something larger at play. The young pro bono lawyer, a sharp woman fresh out of law school, found a procedural loophole, a tiny crack in the edifice of the original ruling that no one had ever thought to explore. This wasn't an easy path. Every step was contested, every document scrutinized for the slightest imperfection. But with each challenge, Eleanor felt a deeper resolve solidify within her. It was as if the universe itself was slowly, deliberately, nudging the pieces into place, preparing for a revelation that would shake the very foundations of what everyone believed to be true. Her heart, once heavy with resignation, now beat with a quiet, persistent rhythm of expectation, fueled by the slow, inexorable march of truth. The legal battle, though still in its nascent stages, began to unearth forgotten fragments of the past. The original will, drafted by Arthur Sterling, had been meticulously organized, seemingly ironclad. However, the young lawyer, Sarah, possessed an unwavering tenacity. She pored over archive boxes, dusty ledgers, and microfilm records, searching for anything amiss. Most dismissed her efforts, confident that Sterling's work was beyond reproach. Then, one late night, hunched over a faded tax record from decades ago, she found it. A discrepancy so subtle, so easily overlooked, that it might as well have been invisible. It wasn't a smoking gun, not yet, but it was a loose thread, promising to unravel a much larger tapestry of deceit. The record showed a transfer of a minor plot of land, intended for Eleanor's mother, that had been quietly diverted and then later consolidated into one of her uncle's portfolios, with no clear paper trail of sale or compensation. The original inheritance had been designed to keep Eleanor's mother, and by extension, Eleanor herself, in a state of perpetual dependence, preventing them from ever truly rising above their circumstances. This single piece of paper, a seemingly insignificant transaction buried amidst hundreds, spoke volumes about the deliberate nature of the injustice. It pointed not to an oversight, but to a calculated maneuver. Eleanor felt a surge of cold fury, quickly followed by a strange sense of validation. Her lifelong feeling of being systematically deprived wasn't just a bitter personal perception. It was rooted in a tangible, historical wrong. This discovery was the first undeniable proof that what she had always suspected was horrifyingly true, and it ignited a new fire within her, a hunger for the full truth, no matter how painful it might be. The revelation of the diverted land plot sent a ripple of unease through the opposing family members, particularly Eleanor's uncle Richard. He had always presented himself as a benevolent patriarch, generously offering Eleanor occasional financial aid, while quietly benefiting from her family's original share of the inheritance. Now, his carefully constructed facade began to crack. His lawyers, powerful and well-funded, immediately moved to discredit the new evidence, labeling it a clerical error or a misinterpretation of historical records. They launched an aggressive counteroffensive, filing motions to suppress the tax record, arguing its irrelevance and age. Their tactics were designed to overwhelm Eleanor and Sarah, burying them in paperwork and draining their already strained resources. Richard himself resorted to more personal attacks, spreading rumors in the community that Eleanor was merely seeking to profit from her deceased relative's legacy, driven by greed. He painted her as ungrateful, a troublemaker disrupting the peace of the family. The whispers began to circulate, testing Eleanor's resolve. Old friends looked at her differently, some with suspicion, others with pity. It was an isolating experience, facing down not just a legal team, but a deeply entrenched social narrative. Yet, the seed of truth had been planted, and it was stubborn. Sarah, unyielding, countered every motion, fought every insult. She argued that a clerical error of this magnitude, benefiting one party significantly at the expense of another, was not an error but a design. The fight moved from obscure legal texts to the very heart of the family's public image, and Eleanor knew, deep down, that the truth, once stirred, would not be easily put back to sleep. The legal arena transformed into a battleground, not just of documents and precedents, but of wills and determination. Eleanor found herself confronting Richard in deposition after deposition, enduring his condescending tone and the thinly veiled threats from his counsel. Each session was emotionally draining, a brutal excavation of old wounds and long-suppressed frustrations. Richard maintained his air of injured innocence, portraying himself as the victim of Eleanor's ungrateful avarice. His lawyers presented reams of financial records, meticulously crafted to obscure the initial injustice, highlighting Eleanor's past struggles as proof of her unstable character rather than a consequence of the very deprivation she was now fighting against. Sarah, however, remained a beacon of steadfast resolve. She meticulously cross-referenced every claim, every ledger entry, building her case brick by painful brick. She began to connect the dots between the seemingly isolated clerical error and other minor land transactions, realizing that the diversion of Eleanor's mother's land was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern. It was a strategy of slow erosion, gradually diminishing one branch of the family while inflating another. Eleanor, witnessing Sarah's unwavering dedication and keen intellect, felt her own faith in the process solidify. The fight was far from over, and the emotional toll was heavy, but the initial indignation had morphed into a righteous resolve. She was no longer just fighting for herself. She was fighting for the memory of her mother, for the truth, and for the principle that even the most deeply buried injustices could and should be brought to light. Just when the weight of the legal battle threatened to crush Eleanor, a crucial breakthrough arrived, not from within the court, but from the most unexpected of places. An elderly former clerk who had worked for Arthur Sterling decades ago, now living in a nursing home, contacted Sarah after hearing whispers of the revived case. His conscience, it seemed, had been troubled for years. He remembered details, small but significant, about Sterling's practices and his close ties to Richard's father, Eleanor's grandfather. More importantly, he recalled a specific, hurried revision to the will, made days before Eleanor's grandfather passed. A revision he had always found odd. He directed Sarah to an obscure filing cabinet in Sterling's old office, long since converted to storage, which contained a shadow file, an unofficial collection of notes and drafts that Sterling kept separate from the official records. Within this dusty file, Sarah discovered a handwritten addendum from Eleanor's grandfather, clearly stating his intention for Eleanor's mother to receive a specific, significant parcel of land, far greater than what was eventually recorded in the official will. The addendum was dated earlier than the final official will, and subsequent notes from Sterling indicated he had persuaded the grandfather to simplify things, effectively bypassing his true wishes. This wasn't just a clerical error, it was a clear manipulation. Eleanor wept upon seeing it, tears of both grief for her grandfather's betrayed wishes and overwhelming relief. The scales, slowly but surely, were beginning to move. If you're finding strength and inspiration in stories like Eleanor's, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more tales of perseverance and divine justice, reminding us all that hope never truly fades. The discovery of the handwritten addendum and Sterling's hidden notes sent shockwaves through the legal proceedings. It transformed the narrative from a dispute over a clerical error into an accusation of deliberate manipulation and potential elder abuse, a much graver offense. The judge, initially skeptical of reopening such an old case, now viewed the proceedings with heightened interest, demanding full transparency from Richard's legal team. The once impenetrable fortress of Richard's defense began to show visible cracks. His lawyers, caught off guard by the depth of Sarah's investigation, struggled to contain the fallout. The elderly clerk's testimony, though fragile due to his age, was compelling and consistent, lending significant weight to the discovery. News of the unfolding drama, fueled by the small-town grapevine, began to filter into the local community. People who had once dismissed Eleanor as a resentful relative now listened with growing interest. Whispers of old Sterling's secrets and the family's dark dealings replaced the old rumors about Eleanor's greed. A silent shift in public sentiment began to occur. Neighbors who had previously offered only polite nods now offered genuine words of encouragement. This shift, more than any legal document, was a powerful validation for Eleanor. It showed that the truth, once brought to light, possessed an undeniable power to sway hearts and minds. She felt a growing sense of vindication, a recognition that her fight was not merely for personal gain, but for a fundamental principle of justice that resonated deeply with the community. The weight of the newly revealed evidence pressed heavily on Richard and his family. The initial smug confidence that had characterized their demeanor slowly eroded, replaced by a visible strain. Their legal team, once aggressive and dismissive, now adopted a more defensive posture, frequently requesting adjournments and attempting to negotiate settlements outside of court. But Eleanor, emboldened by the truth, refused to back down. This was no longer just about money. It was about honoring her grandfather's true intentions and righting a decades-old wrong. Richard, in a desperate attempt to salvage his reputation, tried to appeal directly to Eleanor, offering a paltry sum in exchange for her silence and the withdrawal of the lawsuit. He even went so far as to invoke their shared family name, implying that her actions were bringing shame upon them all. Eleanor, however, was past being intimidated by his ploys. She saw through his hollow gestures, recognizing them for what they were, a desperate attempt to avoid public humiliation and the full force of justice. She calmly yet firmly rejected his offer, stating that the truth was not for sale. This refusal marked a critical turning point. It was the first time Richard had faced a consequence for his actions, the first time his power and influence had failed to bend someone to his will. The realization that he could no longer control the narrative, that the scales were indeed tilting, began to manifest as visible frustration and anger, signaling that their carefully constructed world of impunity was finally crumbling before their very eyes. With each passing day, Sarah meticulously pieced together more fragments of the past. The shadow file proved to be a treasure trove, revealing not only the manipulated addendum, but also a series of correspondence between Arthur Sterling and Richard's father, discussing strategies to manage the inheritance in a way that secured the family's future, which implicitly meant securing Richard's future at the expense of others. These letters, written in a veiled, coded language, hinted at a systematic plan to disenfranchise Eleanor's maternal line. They spoke of safeguarding assets and preventing fragmentation, euphemisms for consolidating wealth and power within one specific branch of the family. The evidence painted a grim picture of deliberate, calculated injustice. It wasn't a sudden act of malice, but a slow, methodical stripping away of what was rightfully Eleanor's. This further solidified Eleanor's resolve. She realized the depth of the betrayal, not just against her mother, but against the very spirit of her grandfather's legacy. The feeling of indignity, which had simmered for so long, now found a clear, undeniable target. The legal team for Richard struggled to explain away the growing pile of incriminating documents. Their arguments grew weaker, their justifications less plausible. The once clear lines of defense blurred, leaving them vulnerable to the relentless onslaught of truth that Sarah was so expertly orchestrating. The foundation of the family's wealth, once seen as a testament to their shrewdness, now appeared to be built on a deliberate and profound injustice. The relentless pressure of the ongoing lawsuit began to take its toll on Eleanor, not just financially, but emotionally. Sleepless nights were filled with replays of courtroom confrontations and the painful memories of her mother's quiet struggles. The constant scrutiny and the public nature of the battle were exhausting. There were moments of doubt, fleeting impulses to just give up, to accept whatever meager settlement Richard might offer, and retreat to a quiet life free from the spotlight. She questioned if the fight was truly worth the emotional price, if she was strong enough to see it through. Yet, in these moments of vulnerability, she found strength in unexpected places. The unwavering support of Sarah, her dedicated lawyer, was a constant source of encouragement. Sarah's belief in Eleanor's cause was infectious, reminding her of the moral imperative behind their struggle. Furthermore, the small gestures of support from community members, a kind word from a grocery store clerk, a knowing nod from an old acquaintance, even a silent prayer from a church elder, began to form a protective shield around her. These acts of solidarity, however small, reminded her that she was not alone. The initial indignation had matured into a profound sense of purpose. Her fight was not merely for restitution, but for recognition, for the validation of her family's rightful place, and for the simple, profound triumph of truth over long-standing deceit. Each small victory, each piece of uncovered truth fueled her forward, transforming her exhaustion into a resilient determination to finally bring the entire saga to its just conclusion. The case entered its most decisive phase, the presentation of arguments to the court for a final ruling on the inheritance. The courtroom was packed, reflecting the community's growing interest in a story that had become more compelling than any local drama. Sarah delivered her opening statement with a calm conviction that belied her years, methodically laying out the timeline of deception, from the manipulated addendum to the coded letters. She presented the evidence of systematic disenfranchisement, painting a clear picture of how Eleanor's family had been strategically marginalized, denied their rightful share, and kept in a disadvantaged position for decades. Richard's legal team, on the other hand, appeared increasingly desperate. Their arguments relied heavily on technicalities and attempts to discredit the elderly clerk's testimony, portraying him as confused and unreliable. They tried to shift blame onto Arthur Sterling, claiming Richard himself was merely an innocent beneficiary of his father's and Sterling's decisions. However, the sheer volume of new evidence, coupled with Sarah's logical and compelling narrative, made their defense sound hollow and unconvincing. Eleanor sat stoically, listening intently, her heart a mix of anxiety and a quiet, profound hope. She saw the faces in the gallery, some sympathetic, some curious, and she knew that the truth, finally, was being heard, not just by the judge, but by the very community that had silently observed her struggles for so long. The final chapter of this long and arduous battle was about to be written. A pivotal moment arrived with the testimony of a retired forensic document examiner, a recognized expert in deciphering aged handwriting and paper. Sarah had painstakingly found this specialist, knowing that the authenticity of her grandfather's handwritten addendum was crucial. The expert took the stand and, with methodical precision, presented his findings. He confirmed that the addendum was indeed authentic, undoubtedly written by Eleanor's grandfather, and that its date predated the final official will presented by Arthur Sterling. More damningly, He testified that the ink and paper of the addendum were consistent with other documents from that period, making it impossible to dismiss as a recent forgery. He further elaborated on how the language in Sterling's subsequent notes clearly indicated a deliberate alteration of the grandfather's original intent, effectively bypassing his direct wishes. This testimony was a devastating blow to Richard's defense. It stripped away any remaining claims of a clerical error or misunderstanding. The expert's unbiased, scientific evidence resonated powerfully, lending an irrefutable weight to Eleanor's claims. Richard and his lawyers watched, visibly stunned, as their last credible line of defense crumbled. Eleanor, though maintaining her composure, felt a rush of vindication. The scales were not just tipping, they were swinging dramatically, propelled by the undeniable force of objective truth, shattering decades of carefully constructed lies and rewriting a family's history in the full light of day. The momentum in the courtroom had shifted irrevocably. The judge, whose initial demeanor had been one of cautious impartiality, now displayed a clear inclination towards Eleanor's case. The testimony of the forensic expert, combined with the elderly clerk's corroboration and the damning evidence from Sterling's shadow file, created an overwhelming cascade of truth. Richard's legal team, once formidable, now appeared to be scrambling, their arguments increasingly fragmented and unconvincing. They tried to pivot, suggesting that Eleanor's grandfather might have had a change of heart, or that Sterling was simply acting in what he believed to be the family's best interest. But these attempts felt hollow, contradicted by the clear documentary evidence of deliberate obfuscation. The courtroom itself seemed to hold its breath, witnessing the slow, majestic unfolding of justice. Eleanor watched as her uncle, Richard, who had exuded an air of untouchable authority for so long, now appeared diminished, his face etched with a mix of fear and indignation. The weight of public scrutiny, coupled with the dismantling of his carefully crafted narrative, was clearly crushing him. For Eleanor, this wasn't about gloating. It was about the profound satisfaction of seeing truth emerge from the shadows. The scales, once heavily weighted against her, now swung visibly, undeniably in her favor, not through manipulation or clever legal tricks, but through the simple, persistent unveiling of facts that had been buried for too long. The feeling of righteous indignation was slowly giving way to a profound sense of satisfaction, as if a great, heavy burden was finally being lifted from her shoulders. The court's proceedings soon reached a point where the true nature of the antagonist's prior actions was laid bare for all to see. Sarah's closing argument was a powerful synthesis of all the evidence, painting a damning portrait of systemic manipulation. She detailed how Arthur Sterling, acting in concert with Richard's father, had methodically altered the will, not just to benefit one branch of the family, but to deliberately diminish the other, keeping them in a position of perceived charity rather than rightful inheritance. The letters in the shadow file, previously coded, were now interpreted in the context of all other evidence, revealing a clear conspiracy. The intent was no longer debatable. It was undeniable. The initial clerical error was exposed as a calculated act, one of many, designed to secure greater wealth and influence for Richard's lineage. The courtroom was silent as Sarah meticulously connected each piece of the puzzle, revealing the full extent of the decades-long injustice. Richard's carefully cultivated image as a generous benefactor shattered, replaced by the grim reality of a man who had directly benefited from deceit. Eleanor felt a cold satisfaction as the truth, raw and unvarnished, finally echoed through the halls of justice. It was a moment of profound vindication, not just for her, but for her mother and all those who had suffered silently under the shadow of this calculated deception. The indignation that had fueled her for so long now transformed into a quiet certainty that true justice, though slow, was inevitable. The local media, initially hesitant to cover what seemed like a mundane family dispute, now seized upon the unfolding drama. The story of the manipulated inheritance, the hidden shadow file, and the elderly clerk's brave testimony became front-page news. Local television stations ran segments, and the community online forums buzzed with discussions. Public outrage grew as the details of the decades-long deception became widely known. People expressed shock and anger at how a prominent family and a respected lawyer could have so brazenly engineered such an injustice. Support for Eleanor surged, with many citizens feeling a personal connection to her struggle against powerful, unethical forces. This public amplification transformed the case from a private family affair into a community cause. Eleanor, once an isolated figure, found herself surrounded by a wave of public sympathy and solidarity. She received countless messages of support, not just from friends, but from strangers who had felt similarly wronged by life's imbalances. This collective voice provided an immense boost to her morale, reminding her that her fight resonated with a universal human desire for fairness and accountability. The shame and isolation she had often felt were replaced by a sense of shared purpose. The tide had truly turned, and the very community that had once been subtly influenced by Richard's narrative was now demanding justice, demonstrating the powerful collective impact of truth finally brought into the light. Under the relentless glare of public scrutiny and the irrefutable weight of the evidence, Richard and his legal team began to show significant cracks, his once composed demeanor completely unraveled. During one particularly intense cross-examination, he lashed out at Sarah, accusing her of defamation, a desperate outburst that only served to further damage his credibility in the eyes of the court and the public. His lawyers, once arrogant, now appeared harried and visibly frustrated. They made repeated attempts to introduce irrelevant information, to delay proceedings, anything to stem the inevitable tide. The internal strain within Richard's family also became apparent. Whispers of discord among his children and cousins began to circulate, as some members questioned the wisdom of continuing to fight a losing battle, risking further public humiliation. The carefully constructed facade of family unity, built on the foundations of ill-gotten gains, crumbled under pressure. For Eleanor, observing this disintegration was not a moment of triumph, but a somber reflection on the destructive power of greed and deceit. She saw the human cost of injustice, not just for the wronged, but for the perpetrators themselves, as their lives and reputations imploded. The indignation had now fully given way to a quiet satisfaction, watching the scales of justice, so long unbalanced, slowly, definitively, right themselves. Despite the undeniable momentum in her favor, there were still moments when Eleanor felt a chill of doubt. The sheer magnitude of the years of injustice, the depth of the betrayal, occasionally threatened to overwhelm her. Could she truly trust that justice would prevail, or would some last-minute legal maneuver snatch victory from her grasp? These were moments of profound vulnerability, when the decades of being marginalized whispered insidious doubts into her mind. The thought of losing, after coming so far, was almost unbearable. Yet, in these darkest moments, a profound sense of faith would rise within her. It wasn't a blind optimism, but a deep, unwavering conviction that the journey itself had been guided by something larger than human will. The preacher's words, "God sets the scales at sundown," echoed in her heart, not as a metaphor, but as a living truth. She remembered the unexpected support, the serendipitous discovery of the shadow file, the elderly clerk's troubled conscience. Too many coincidences to be merely chance. This was a testament to divine providence, to a justice that transcended legal statutes. This renewed faith became her anchor, transforming her lingering doubt into a quiet, unshakable certainty that she was not fighting alone, and that the ultimate outcome was already ordained by a higher power that would not be denied. The moment of the final arguments arrived, charged with a palpable tension. Sarah stood before the court, her voice calm and resolute, as she presented a masterful summary of the case. She meticulously reviewed every piece of evidence: the manipulated will, the damning notes from Arthur Sterling, the forensic analysis, the clerk's testimony, weaving them into an irrefutable narrative of deliberate injustice. Her argument was not just legally sound, it was morally resonant, appealing to the fundamental human desire for fairness. She spoke of the profound impact of such long-standing deception on Eleanor's life and on the memory of her grandfather's true intentions. Richard's lead counsel, visibly strained, delivered a final defense that was a shadow of their initial aggressive posture. They focused on technicalities, pleading for leniency, and trying to portray Richard as a victim of circumstances and misguided advice. Their arguments lacked conviction, unable to counter the overwhelming weight of the truth that Sarah had so painstakingly revealed. Eleanor sat, her hands clasped, a profound sense of peace settling over her. She had done all she could. The truth was out, fully and completely. The stage was set, the evidence presented. Now it was up to the scales of justice, guided by the unseen hand she had come to trust so implicitly. The long journey from quiet indignation to hopeful expectation was nearing its ultimate destination. A hush fell over the courtroom as the judge prepared to deliver his ruling. The tension in the air was thick, a tangible entity felt by everyone present. Days had passed since the final arguments, each hour stretching into an eternity for Eleanor. She had spent these days in quiet contemplation, rereading her grandfather's old letters, reflecting on her mother's resilient spirit, and finding solace in the unwavering support of Sarah. The community, too, waited with bated breath. The story had captivated them, embodying a universal yearning for the triumph of good over wrong. Eleanor's heart pounded, a drumbeat of anticipation and trepidation. She had faced so much, endured so many doubts and humiliations, that the thought of this moment was almost surreal. The outcome would not just dictate her future, but also validate a lifetime of quiet struggle and the memory of those who had been wronged. She closed her eyes for a moment, recalling the preacher's words, "God sets the scales at sundown." She visualized those scales, once heavily tilted against her, now hovering, waiting for the final weight of truth to settle them. It was a moment of profound significance, not just for the legal outcome, but for the reaffirmation of her deepest belief in a justice that operates beyond human manipulation, a divine order that patiently, persistently brings all things to light. The judge's voice, clear and resonant, finally broke the silence. He meticulously recounted the findings, citing the manipulated addendum, Arthur Sterling's clandestine notes, the forensic evidence, and the corroborating testimony of the elderly. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, a collective gasp echoing the internal turmoil of every soul present. The projector screen, stark and unforgiving, displayed bank statements, witness affidavits, and recorded conversations that meticulously detailed the calculated conspiracy. Not just a minor oversight, but a deliberate, sustained effort to disenfranchise Clara. Elias and his wife, once so composed and confident in their deceit, visibly crumbled. Their faces, pale and drawn, betrayed the years of their treachery, now laid bare for all to see. The weight of the evidence wasn't merely circumstantial. It was an ironclad case, forged in their own words and actions, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that they had systematically siphoned funds, forged documents, and manipulated their elderly relative, all to usurp Clara's rightful inheritance. The lawyer, Mr. Henderson, presented each piece with a calm, almost clinical precision, letting the facts speak for themselves. There was no need for theatrics. The truth was devastating enough. Elias stammered, attempting to interject with feeble denials, but his words were hollow, drowned out by the irrefutable proof. His wife began to weep, not tears of remorse, but of bitter defeat, as their carefully constructed empire of lies collapsed around them. The judge, a figure of stern impartiality throughout the proceedings, called for order, though the room was already settling into a stunned silence. His gaze, however, lingered on Elias and his wife, a silent condemnation in his eyes. He then turned to Clara, who sat with a quiet strength, her initial shock now replaced by a profound sense of vindication. It wasn't triumph, not in the malicious sense, but the serene peace that comes when justice, long denied, finally emerges from the shadows. The legal ramifications were clear, and the initial ruling was swift and decisive. The forged will was invalidated, the manipulated transfers reversed, and the entirety of the inheritance, along with considerable damages, was awarded back to Clara. The news spread like wildfire through their small community. Whispers turned into open discussions, and those who had once sided with Elias, swayed by his carefully crafted image, now expressed shame and disbelief. The intricate web of deceit, spun over years, had been meticulously unraveled by a series of unlikely events and determined individuals, all converging at precisely the right moment. The sense of indignation that had simmered for so long within Clara and her small circle of supporters began to give way to a cautious, almost sacred satisfaction. This wasn't merely a legal victory. It felt like a cosmic righting of wrongs, a true testament to an unseen hand guiding the scales. The aftermath was a whirlwind of legal finalities, but for Clara, it was a period of quiet reflection. She wasn't consumed by vengeance or gloating. Instead, a profound sense of peace settled within her. The inheritance itself, while substantial, felt secondary to the restoration of truth and dignity. She saw Elias and his wife only once more, during a final court appearance where their appeals were decisively rejected. Their arrogance had been replaced by a hollow defeat, their once proud demeanor shattered. They avoided her gaze, unable to face the woman they had so cruelly wronged. Clara felt no joy in their downfall, only a quiet understanding of the consequences of their actions. She began to plan how to honor her aunt's legacy, establishing a local scholarship fund in her name, a way to transform past pain into future hope for others. The community, once divided, now rallied around her, extending apologies and support. Many shared stories of similar injustices they or their families had faced, finding a glimmer of hope in Clara's story. The preacher's words, "God sets the scales at sundown," resonated deeply with her. It wasn't about seeking revenge, but about trusting that eventually every hidden thing would be brought to light and every wrong would be made right, often in ways no human could orchestrate. Clara's story became a beacon, a quiet testament to the enduring power of faith and the unyielding nature of divine justice. Her journey from humiliation to vindication wasn't just a personal victory. It was a profound illustration that some battles are fought on a plane beyond human comprehension, where the ultimate arbiter ensures that truth prevails. The injustice she suffered, initially so devastating, became the fertile ground from which a renewed sense of purpose and a deeper understanding of grace blossomed. She learned that while the world may often seem unjust and human actions can be cruel, there is a higher order at play, patiently waiting, observing, and ultimately correcting. It taught her, and those who heard her story, that steadfastness in the face of adversity is never in vain, and that hope is always justified. The message was clear, echoing the timeless wisdom. God's timing brings a justice the world doesn't understand. If Clara's journey has resonated with you, and if you believe in the power of this kind of unwavering faith, please consider leaving a comment below. Share your own stories of divine intervention, or simply let us know how this narrative touched your heart. Your engagement helps us share more stories that inspire and uplift.